We are now beginning the information for the fourth test over the Romantic period. The first lecture is the symphony progression. The symphony progression begins first with the Baroque period, where in the Baroque period there were several instrumental forms that exhibited multiple sections or multiple movements. The Italian overture and the French overture, the Concerto, the Sonata da Chiesa, and the Sonata da Camera led us to the Italian suites. One of the composers of the Italian suites was Antonio Vivaldi, and then later we get to the School of Mannheim and finally arrive at the sonata cycle for the classic period. The classic period composers were Haydn and Mozart, and then our transitional composer is Beethoven, who leads us from the classic to the Romantic period. Beethoven composed 9 symphonies. 7 of those symphonies are absolute, 2 are programmatic. Once we arrive in the Romantic period, composers tend to choose either to do absolute symphonies or programmatic symphonies. Since Beethoven did both styles, it was fine. Beethoven is very idolized in the Romantic period by all of the different classical composers. But because of another composer's words in a journal, there was a line drawn in the sand, and composers either did one of these two types, but not both. Either they were an absolute symphony composer or a program symphony composer. Beethoven's 2 program symphonies are the 6th Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, that were sounds from nature that he would soon no longer be able to enjoy. We have the chirping of birds, we have a storm that approaches, dance music for the people involved within the Pastoral Symphony. Again, if you've listened to the first Fantasia by Walt Disney, then you've heard the Pastoral Symphony. The 9th Symphony of Beethoven includes a text in the last movement. The text of the poet Friedrich Schiller called Ode to Joy is included, and so it's a choral composition. With there being a text, of course, it's relaying a certain message. And that's what program music is all about. Program music is instrumental music that tells a story. It's narrating a sequence of events, it's depicting certain images, and so some composers are going to follow suit with that. Now that we are in the Romantic period, and I'm using the dates of 1810 to 1915 for our dates for the Romantic period, we have 4 composers who fall under the absolute camp: Franz Schubert, Robert Schumann, Felix Mendelssohn, and Johannes Brahms. Well, you will notice that these are German and Austrian composers who are following suit with the first Viennese school of music, being Haydn, Mozart, and early Beethoven. Program composers include Hector Berlioz from France, Modest Mussorgsky from Russia, Richard Strauss from Austria, and the Hungarian composer Franz Liszt. So the program composers seem to be from all over the place. We're going to focus now on program music. There are several different types of program compositions, and we first heard about program music from Antonio Vivaldi in his 4 Seasons, where you had the sonnets and then later the music. Well, there are 3 different styles of program music that I would like you to be familiar with. The first one is the program symphony, which is a multi-movement work for orchestra. So this is great if a composer is relating different chapters or different segments of a poetic cycle. And then there is a symphonic poem or a tone poem, which is a single movement work for orchestra. So if you are relating just a single poem, or maybe you're talking about just a singular occurrence within a story, then a 1-movement tone poem would suffice. And then the other type of program music that I would like you to know is incidental music. Today we would call this soundtrack music. Incidental music was music that was composed to existing plays, an overture and music to be played in certain important scenes and in between the scenes and in between the acts for more fluidity, more time motion. So a great example of a program symphony is the Symphonie Fantastique, or the Fantastic Symphony by Hector Berlioz. That's what I'm going to talk about momentarily. A great example of a symphonic poem or tone poem is The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas. Again, if you've seen either of the two fantasias, then one of the centerpiece compositions is where Mickey dons the magician's hat. He conjures the broom or the mop to come to life to do his chores, and that is set as a one-movement work for orchestra, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And then Felix Mendelssohn's incidental music to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is the most important incidental music to come out of the Romantic period. So important that when A Midsummer Night's Dream was made into a feature film, probably about 10, 12 years ago at this point, featuring Callista Flockhart and some other great actors, the soundtrack used Mendelssohn's original score and then added a few other ideas. But let's focus on the program symphony and focus on our French program composer, Hector Berlioz. Berlioz was born in 1803, and again, 1803 is very significant in music because that's the first year of Romantic music, where Beethoven had achieved his third symphony. So Berlioz is being born at a time when Romanticism is beginning within the field of music. Berlioz's parents had differing viewpoints about God. His father was a physician and an atheist. His mother was a staunch member of the Roman Catholic Church. And she kind of won out in terms of how her children were going to be raised. Berlioz and his brothers and sisters were brought up in the church and educated by the church. Berlioz loved music. He was a singer. He played the flute, and he also played the guitar. And so when it came time for him to go off to college, he knew from the get-go that he was supposed to major in medicine. So he enrolled in the medical school in Paris because his father expected him to take over the family practice. This was a miserable existence for Berlioz. Berlioz did not enjoy his classwork. He did not enjoy especially his biology classes and the dissections. He wanted to be involved in music. And so in his extra time, he found out that there was a flute opening in the orchestra at the Paris Opera House. So he auditioned and he got the part. So he was actually being able to make money through his music. So he returned home after his first academic year and told his parents that he did not want to continue with medicine. He wanted to enroll in the Conservatory of Music. This enraged the father. And the father said, if you're going to choose such a frivolous career, then you can be on your own. You're no longer my son. Berlioz had enough of a backbone to accept those conditions, and so he went back to Paris on his own. For the next several years, he had no face-to-face contact with his family, only wrote letters with his mother and some of the brothers and sisters. But Berlioz was overjoyed to be enrolled in the Conservatory of Music and pursuing what he wanted to. As a music student, when you are placed with a specific teacher, then that teacher usually has a lot of influence over you. They pass along their loves, and Berlioz, wanting to be a composition major, was placed with the teacher Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt, a very well-known composer, was a brilliant pianist, but he also loved program music. And so his love of program music was passed along to his students, which included Hector Berlioz. And so Berlioz thrived and did very well for his first years in the Conservatory of Music. But then we arrive at the summer before his senior year. Berlioz had been working nonstop. He had been doing very well in school, but he decided to take the summer off to rest and relax. And he found out that there was a troupe of actors who were coming to town, and they were going to be producing Shakespearean plays. And Berlioz had loved Shakespeare as he was growing up. So night after night, he attended all of these theatrical plays. And there was a leading lady in the troupe whose name was Harriet Smithson. And she really caught Hector's attention, to the point that Hector started to send her gifts, send her little love notes, asking her to come out and see him after an evening's performance. none of his advances were ever made, ever acknowledged. And so when it came time for the troupe to pull up their stakes and move on, Berlioz decided, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to follow my dreams. I'm going to try and meet this lady. She is my one true love. And so Berlioz basically stalked this lady throughout the summer. And they eventually arrived in Vienna. There, nearly penniless, Berlioz is going to knock on the door of his teacher, Franz Liszt. Originally from Hungary, he was a composer in residence at the Paris Conservatory of Music, but now he's at home in Vienna during the off-season. And so Berlioz goes to his teacher and says, won't you please help me meet this woman? And since Liszt was in the same social circle as the actors in the troupe, he threw a ball and introduced Hector to Harriet because she and the other actors did attend. They had a dance together, but she must have said, now aren't you sweet, kissed him on his forehead and said, please leave me alone. And so Hector was very dejected, very upset, and didn't know how to go on with his life. But then the sage advice comes from his teacher and his wife, and they say, Hector, go back home. You're about to start your senior year at the conservatory, but use your experiences. Use all of this as your inspiration to create your senior project. So Berlioz tucks his tail and he goes back to Paris. And he starts to write out some autobiographical ideas. The first part he calls Reveries, Passions, where the love-sick artist in great despair falls in love with this beautiful beloved creature. Berlioz is the lovesick artist. The beloved is Harriet Smithson. The second movement is called A Ball, and he talks about the first meeting between the two. The third is called In the Country, and in the country he talks about shepherds giving him wise, sage advice, saying that you'll find love, go on with your life. But Berlioz knew that it just didn't have enough. It didn't have an X factor, an it factor to it. So back at home with his buddies, who he had met in his early days of being in Paris, they enjoyed one particular drug, and that drug was opium. So in an opium-enhanced dream, Berlioz is able to see visions of how his story might play out. So once he comes to, he's able to finish off the final two sketches. The fourth segment is called March to the Scaffold. Since the lovesick artist in great despair cannot have the beautiful beloved creature, he didn't want anybody else to have her either, so he murders the beloved. And then for having killed her, he is now being led to the scaffold. You even hear the shoop, the fall of the blade and the music and the plunk plunk of the head falling off the platform. It's wonderful. And so at the end, the lovesick artist is executed. The final segment is called Dream of a Witch's Sabbath, where who comes to escort the soul of the lovesick artist to hell? Well, it's the soul of the beloved, and she wants to make sure that he's placed in the worst realm of Dante's Inferno, so to speak. The movement that I want you to listen to is March to the Scaffold. This is showcasing how the sonata cycle is evolving. You've probably heard the cliche before. You have to learn the rules before you can break them. And so all of these symphonic composers, they knew the classic sonata cycle. This particular movement uses two different melodies, and so it kind of echoes the sonata allegro and the sonata rondo concept. One of the melodies is this plodding march as the lovesick artist is taken to the scaffold. But another is the aspect of the French Revolution and the aspect of how the French, well, they love their beheadings. And so it's kind of this party atmosphere as they're watching all of these people go to their death. But the reason that we talk about the Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz is because of the beloved. In each movement, each of the 5 movements of the symphony, this programmed symphony, the beloved is thought of. And so Berlioz comes up with a melodic phrase that represents her. And we hear in solo clarinet the melodic phrase for the beloved just before the fall of the blade. So the phrase actually is not completed because he's executed before it completes, but that's where you're going to hear this fixed idea, or in the French, the idée fixe. This concept of allowing a musical phrase to represent a certain person is going to be very important in the Romantic period. It's something that we're all very well aware of today, because if you like a particular movie, or if you hear a particular melody in a soap opera that you might watch, then you know exactly what person or what love affair or whatever they're talking about, because the music is so familiar. Commercial jingles use this as well. This is one of the first times that this thought is ever used. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Berlioz in his later life. So the Symphonie Fantastique is completed. He passes with flying colors. The faculty say, "You ought to enter this in the competition, Hector." And there's a very prestigious composition competition called the Prix de Rome. And he enters it and he wins. Then suddenly he's in the social circle that he needed to have been in to capture the attention of Harriet Smithson. But the timing, it just didn't work out. So Hector started to travel with his symphony. He fell in love with a flute player within his orchestra. Her name was Camille Boeck. They got married. Their marriage lasts for 3 years. Toward the end of the marriage, she has a child, and unfortunately the child dies in its infancy. At the time of the passing of the child, Hector's not at home. He's actually touring with his symphony. So you have to remember the Pony Express days. So Camille sends him a letter to explain what's happened. Hector sends her a letter back and says, "I'm sorry about the death of our child, but I'm busy." Well, Camille was having an affair with a rich piano manufacturer there in Paris. And so she sends another letter to Hector saying that his services were no longer required. So Hector really just doesn't care about this, because he had received another letter, and this letter was from Harriet. Harriet, who was a little bit older, not acting quite as much, she's now looking for a sugar daddy. And so she's remembered this young, crazy kid who followed her around that one particular summer, who's now written a symphony that's dedicated to her. So she wants to find out what all that's about. So she meets Hector, they date, they marry for 5 years. And during the course of that marriage, she gives birth to 2 children, both of whom die in their infancy as well. Near the end of their marriage, Hector, now reconciled with his family, sends letters to his friends and to his mother and different people asking, "Can anybody remind me why I love Harriet?" And now the wise sage advice comes from his mother. And the mother says, "You know, Hector, I never thought you loved this woman. I just thought you loved Shakespeare. And she was the one that brought the Juliet and the Ophelia to life for you." And Hector says, "You know, Mom, you're right. I do love Shakespeare, but I can't stand her." So he divorces Harriet. He goes on to marry 3 other ladies, 2 of which produce children. Both of those die in their infancy as well. So after the death of the 4th child, Berlioz writes another towering composition, his Requiem, which is dedicated to the 4 children. And then once the 5th child dies, it's rededicated to the passing of his 5 children. But he divorces wife number 5. In 1867, he returns to his family's estate in La Côte, France, in 1867, and dies in 1869. So he lives his final 2 years of life as a hermit. Throughout his life, though, he writes a lot of programmatic compositions and compositions dedicated to the remembrance of his children. One of the interesting things about the Symphonie Fantastique and the Requiem is that there's a tune that's used in both, so that they are tied together. But I hope you've enjoyed the story of Hector Berlioz and the Symphonie Fantastique. When next we meet, we'll talk about nationalism.